the complete history of the White Walkers and the Long Night. Every winter in Westeros carries a warning inside it. Not a warning about cold feet or empty larders, but an older, colder warning. One that grandmothers used to frighten children into finishing their supper and going to bed on time. It says that once, a very long time ago, winter did not end. It says that something walked out of the far north with blue eyes and dead hands, and that it very nearly finished the world before the world finished it. For thousands of years, most people who heard that warning treated it exactly the way you would expect, as a story, a Grumpkin's tale, something told by old maids at Winterfell to keep boys from wandering north of the wall alone. Then the dead started walking again, and everyone who had laughed at the story had to decide very quickly whether they still found it funny. This is the complete story of what that warning actually meant, where it came from, and what it cost to finally put it to rest. Before the wall stood, before the Night's Watch existed to guard it, before anyone in Westeros had a word for winter that meant anything other than a cold season that eventually passed, the continent belonged to two peoples who had never needed a wall at all. The first were the children of the forest, a small, ancient, magic-touched race who lived inside the deep woods of Westeros and shaped their entire spiritual life around a single kind of tree. Weirwoods, pale-barked and blood-leaved, stood at the centre of everything the children believed, and wherever the children settled they carved solemn, watching faces into the trunks, faces with eyes of dried red sap that seemed to follow anyone who passed beneath them. Through those carved faces and the vast underground root systems connecting them, the children practiced a form of magic that let a gifted few among them, the green seers, look across distance, across time, and occasionally into animals themselves, borrowing their senses the way a person might borrow a cloak. The children were not warlike by nature. They were old, patient, and deeply tied to a natural world they had shared for longer than anyone could reliably count. That peace held right up until roughly 12,000 years ago, when a very different kind of people crossed onto the continent from the east. The first men, arriving with bronze weapons, iron will, and an urgent need for farmland that put them on a direct collision course with the very forests the children considered sacred. What followed was not a short war. It was generations of grinding, brutal conflict, fought with bronze axes on one side and the deepest, strangest magic the children possessed on the other. And it is inside that war, at its most desperate and most horrifying point, that the story of the White Walkers actually begins. The making of a monster. By the time the war between the children of the forest and the first men had dragged on for years, the children were losing. Their numbers were smaller to begin with. Their weapons were nothing next to iron and bronze wielded in large numbers, and the invaders showed no sign of slowing their advance into the deep woods. Facing what looked increasingly like extinction, a circle of the children's most powerful greenseers made a decision that would outlive every single one of them, every first man who ever lived, and very nearly the world itself. According to the oldest surviving fragments of this story, the Greenseers took a captured first man prisoner and, using a shard of dragon glass, drove the volcanic black glass directly into his heart. It was meant to be an act of transformation rather than execution, a way of turning a single enemy soldier into a weapon the children themselves could control, something that could match iron and bronze on equal terms, or better than equal terms. What the ritual actually produced was something closer to a curse than a weapon. The man who walked away from that ritual was no longer a man in any sense that mattered. His skin turned the colour of old frost. His eyes became a bright, crystalline, unmistakable blue, glowing faintly even in total darkness. He did not age. He did not tire. He did not feel the cold that would have killed any of his former countrymen in minutes, because in every sense that counted, the cold was now what he was made of. He would come to be remembered in the fragments of legend that survive as the Night King and the race that grew from him, whether through some magic he carried within himself, or through a deliberate continuation of the same ritual performed on other captives, came to be called the Others by the first men who first faced them, and White Walkers by nearly everyone who came after. Whatever the children of the forest hoped their creation might accomplish for their side of the war, it did not stay on their side for long. The Others turned on their makers as readily as they turned on the men who had originally been their target, and by the time both the children and the first men fully understood what had actually been unleashed into the world, it was already too late to undo it. Faced with a threat that no longer distinguished between the two warring peoples at all, the children and the first men did something almost unthinkable, given how long and how bitterly they had been fighting each other. They stopped, and they began, however uneasily, to work together instead. What walks in the dark? To understand why the Others became the single most feared threat in the entire history of Westeros, it helps to understand exactly what they were, because very little about them followed the ordinary rules that governed the rest of the natural world. Physically, a White Walker in its full adult form stood taller than an ordinary man, with limbs that moved with an unnatural, almost musical fluidity, and skin that ranged from a pale corpse-like white to a deep glassy blue depending on age and rank. Their eyes were their most immediately recognizable feature, a searing, unnatural blue that seemed to generate its own faint light, visible even in the near-total darkness of a long night sky. They wore armour that appeared to be carved directly from ice rather than forged or shaped by any human method, and it grew with them, shifting and reforming as though it were a second skin rather than a separate piece of equipment. Ordinary steel did almost nothing to a White Walker. Swords that could cut through mail and plate simply shattered or glanced off harmlessly when swung at one of the Others, a fact that cost the first men dearly in the earlier stages of the war before anyone understood why. Only two substances reliably killed them: dragonglass, the same volcanic obsidian the children had used to create the very first of their kind, and Valyrian steel, the rare, folded, spell-forged metal that would not exist in Westeros for thousands of years after the Long Night ended, since it depended on a civilization, Valyria, that had not even been founded yet. Fire could hold them back and destroy the whites that served under them, but ordinary fire alone was never enough to kill a White Walker outright. Beneath the Others, in their strange, silent hierarchy, marched an army built entirely from the dead. Anybody left exposed to a White Walker's power, whether a fallen soldier, an abandoned corpse, or in the worst recorded cases entire settlements slaughtered specifically to be reanimated afterward. could be raised as a wight, a reanimated corpse driven by nothing resembling a living mind, immune to pain, tireless, and dangerous, purely through overwhelming numbers rather than any individual skill. Wights carried whatever wounds killed them into their new unlife, sometimes missing limbs, sometimes half frozen or half decayed, and they kept moving regardless. Killing a wight required either fire or a strike that destroyed the reanimating magic directly, since ordinary sword wounds that would drop a living man barely slowed one down. The others communicated with each other and apparently commanded their wights through means no living person ever fully understood. Some accounts describe a kind of piercing, layered shriek, more like the sound ice makes when it cracks under pressure than any human language. Others describe a silent, almost telepathic coordination. Entire columns of wights moving in perfect unison without a single audible command passing between them. What is agreed upon, across nearly every surviving account, is that the White Walkers brought the cold with them rather than merely enduring it. Temperatures dropped sharply and suddenly in their presence. Water froze on contact, and the deep, unnatural winter of the long night itself is widely believed to have been less a natural weather event and more a direct consequence of the others' own advance across the continent, as though the land itself were freezing in response to what was marching over it. At the very top of this strange frozen order stood the Night King alone, the original, and by every account the most powerful of his kind, capable of feats none of his followers could match, including, according to the stories that survive from thousands of years later, marking specific individuals across vast distances and even bending the natural order of magic itself when it suited his purposes. The land of always winter. Where exactly the others came from, beyond the specific act of creation that produced the very first of them, remains one of the least understood parts of this entire history. Maps drawn by the Citadel over the centuries mark the far northern reaches beyond the wall with a single, ominous label passed down from expeditions that never returned, to explain what they had actually found, the land of always winter. No reliable account exists of what that territory looks like, beyond the edges glimpsed by the handful of rangers and wildlings who ever travelled deep enough into it and survived to describe it, and fewer still ever came back at all. What can be reasonably inferred from the pattern of the others' behaviour across thousands of years of intermittent activity is that whatever region they consider their home ground is defined less by geography in any conventional sense and more by cold itself, as though the deep, ancient winter that grips the far north of the continent is not simply weather they tolerate, but something closer to their native element, a condition they carry with them and expand outward from rather than merely endure. It is telling that every documented encounter with the others, from the earliest legends of the Long Night through the modern reawakening beyond the wall, describes temperatures dropping sharply in their presence, as though the boundary of the land of always winter moves with them rather than staying fixed on any map. Whether there is a court, a hierarchy, or any form of society among the others beyond the single command structure running down from the Night King is simply unknown, and likely to remain unknown since no one who has ever gotten close enough to observe it has lived to bring the answer home. Patterns in the frost, for an enemy so often described in the panicked reports of the few survivors who ever encountered them as an unthinking horde. The others displayed a surprising amount of deliberate, almost theatrical calculation whenever the story gives us a clear enough view of their behaviour to judge. The earliest confirmed modern sighting of their handiwork, the ring of dead wildlings Waymar Royce's ranging party discovered beyond the wall, was arranged with a precision that served no practical military purpose at all. It killed no one and gained no ground. What it did, and by every indication was clearly meant to do, was communicate. A message left for whoever found it next, delivered in a language no living person fully understood, but that everyone who saw it immediately recognized as a threat. That same pattern of deliberate, almost patient calculation shows up again and again across the war's modern chapter. The Night King waited, by any reasonable estimate, thousands of years before making any confirmed move against the living once the long night ended, choosing a moment when the realm's guard had fallen about as low as it ever had. He pursued Bran Stark specifically and personally once he understood what Bran represented, rather than simply overwhelming Westeros with numbers and letting the three-eyed raven's knowledge become irrelevant once there was no one left alive to use it. He struck at Daenerys's dragons with a single, perfectly aimed throw, rather than attempting to overwhelm her flying advantage through sheer numbers, a decision that suggests either remarkable tactical instinct or, more unsettlingly, some deeper understanding of exactly what would hurt the living side of this war the most. None of this reads like the behaviour of a mindless force of nature. It reads like the behaviour of something that has had 12,000 years to think very carefully about how it intends to finish what it started. The long night begins. Once the others turned against everyone, humans and children of the forest alike, the war that followed was unlike anything either side had fought before. It came to be called the Long Night, and the name is not a poetic exaggeration. According to every surviving account, an unnatural winter descended across the entire continent and simply refused to end, stretching on for what the oldest legends insist was a full generation rather than a single season. Snow reportedly piled 100 feet deep in places. The sun itself was said to vanish behind an unbroken grey sky for years at a stretch, plunging the world into a twilight that never resolved into either day or true night. Behind that endless winter came the army the others had assembled, their own kind, however many there were, leading an ever-growing horde of wights raised from every body they left in their wake. Settlements that stood in their path were not simply defeated, they were converted, their dead rising within hours to join the very force that had just destroyed them, so that the invading army grew larger with every village, castle, and holdfast it swept through. Entire regions of Westeros were reportedly emptied of living inhabitants entirely, and for a time the realistic possibility on the table was not who would win the war, but whether anyone would be left alive to lose it. It is worth pausing here on how little of this survives as anything resembling a reliable record. No first-hand written account of the long night has ever been found, not because none were written, but because writing itself, in any form Maesters would later recognise, may not have existed among the first men at that early point in their history on the continent. Everything we know about this period comes down to us as oral legend, passed from one generation to the next for thousands of years before anyone thought to commit it to parchment and legend, as any Maester will tell you, has a way of growing in the telling. What survives is less a history than a chorus of different voices from different corners of the world, all trying to describe the same catastrophe from their own cultural vantage point. And strikingly, nearly every one of those voices agrees on one specific detail, that somebody, somewhere, found a way to fight back. Heroes of every land. What makes the story of the Long Night's ending so unusual, among all the legends of Westeros and the wider world, is that it does not survive as a single account. It survives as several, told by cultures separated by oceans and thousands of miles, each one insisting that their own hero was the one who actually turned back the darkness. In Westeros, particularly among the descendants of the first men in the north, the figure remembered is called simply the last hero. According to the version passed down through northern legend, as the long night deepened and hope among the first men began to run out entirely, one man set out from the last remaining strongholds with 12 companions, a handful of horses, and a lone direwolf, determined to find the children of the forest and beg them for help in ending the war they had, however unintentionally, unleashed. The journey north was catastrophic. Cold, starvation, and the others themselves picked off the last hero's companions one by one, their horses dying under them, their numbers thinning with every league travelled deeper into the frozen dark. By the time the last hero finally found what he was looking for, only he and his direwolf remained of the party that had set out together. Whether he found the children through their own hidden magic recognizing a desperate ally, or through sheer stubborn persistence, these stories agree that a peace and an alliance were struck in that final meeting, one that would arm the first men with weapons capable of actually killing what they were fighting. Far to the east, in the ancient city of Ashai, and among the followers of the Lord of Light, an entirely different version of the same event is preserved, centered on a figure named Azor Ahai. In this telling, the hero was not a wandering first man, but a warrior tasked directly with forging a weapon capable of standing against the darkness. The legend holds that Azor Ahai laboured for 30 days and nights in a temple to craft a great sword, tempering the blade first in water, where it shattered, and then in the heart of a captured lion, where it shattered again. Only on the third attempt, understanding at last what the sword actually demanded, did he succeed, plunging the unfinished blade directly into the chest of his own beloved wife, Nissa Nissa, and binding her soul into the steel as she died in his arms. The sword that resulted, burning with a heat and light no ordinary weapon could match, became known as Lightbringer, and with it, Azor Ahai is said to have led humanity to victory in a conflict remembered in that tradition as the Battle for the Dawn. Even further east still, in the ancient empire of Yi Ti, records preserved by the Bloodstone Emperor's successors describe a great hero named Yin Tar, who is said to have accomplished essentially the same feat under an entirely different name and in an entirely different cultural framework. Among the Jogos Nhai, the horse-riding people of the Eastern Grass Sea, a hero called Hirkun the Hero fills precisely the same narrative role. Each of these figures is described in strikingly similar terms: someone who rose during a period of endless winter and encroaching darkness, who forged or found a weapon capable of turning the tide, and who led their own people to a victory that pushed the darkness back rather than eliminating it permanently. No serious student of this history believes these are four unrelated legends that happen to converge by coincidence. Far more likely, they represent the same catastrophic global event, filtered through cultures that had no meaningful contact with each other by the time these stories were finally written down, each one reshaping a shared ancestral memory into a hero who looked, sounded, and fought like someone from their own world. The differences between Azor Ahai and the last hero are, in this reading, not the differences between two separate events, but the differences between two storytelling traditions describing the very same one, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. Nyssa and the sword that wept. The Azor Ahai legend deserves lingering on a little longer, not because it is more true than the others, but because of how much weight later generations would eventually place on it. Centuries after the long night ended, followers of the Lord of Light built an entire religious tradition around the promise buried inside this story, that when the darkness returned, as the prophecy insisted it eventually would, Azor Ahai himself would be reborn, born again amid smoke and salt, to wake dragons out of stone and lead humanity through a second long night the way he had supposedly led it through the first. The image at the centre of the story, a man driving a blade through the heart of the woman he loved most in the world in order to save everyone else, is not incidental to why the legend endured so powerfully. Nearly every version insists the sword failed twice before it succeeded, and that its final success depended specifically on a sacrifice made willingly, or at least knowingly, rather than one inflicted by accident or by an enemy. Whatever its factual basis, the story functions as one of the oldest and starkest expressions of a theme that runs through the entire history of this world, that stopping true catastrophe sometimes demands a price, paid in something more personal than gold or soldiers, and that the people who end up paying it rarely get much say in the matter. Red priests and priestesses spent the following millennia scattered across the known world, searching for signs that this promised rebirth had finally arrived, and more than one figure across Westerosi history would eventually be proposed, publicly and often at considerable political cost, as the prince or princess who was promised. Whether any of them, or none of them, actually fulfilled that ancient prophecy is a question this story would only answer many thousands of years later, in a war fought not with a single burning sword, but with dragons, Valyrian steel, and, in the final reckoning, the quiet blade of a girl no prophecy had ever mentioned at all. The last hero's journey, where the Azor Ahai legend focuses on a single dramatic act of sacrifice, the northern legend of the last hero focuses on something almost the opposite: attrition, endurance, and the sheer cost of simply reaching help at all. It is worth telling in fuller detail because it survives among northern small folk and the sisters who eventually collected their tales as one of the most vivid accounts of what the long night actually felt like to live through on the ground. According to the oldest versions of the story, the last hero set out with 12 companions specifically because the First Men leadership at the time understood that a single traveller, however skilled, would not survive the journey north alone. What they did not fully anticipate was just how completely the deepening winter and the advancing others would strip that company down before it ever reached its destination. One companion, the stories say, died of exposure within the first weeks, unable to keep pace once the horses began to falter, Others were picked off in ones and twos by roaming bands of wights, dragged from the edges of the group in the dark, their screams cut short before anyone could turn back to help. By the time the surviving members reached the deepest, coldest reaches of the far north, cold and starvation had done nearly as much damage as the others themselves, and the company that had once numbered 13 men and a direwolf had shrunk to almost nothing. The final stretch of the journey, in nearly every surviving telling, strips away even more. Horses died or had to be abandoned. Weapons were lost or broken. In the grimmest versions of the tale, the last hero and his remaining companions were reduced to eating their own dead mounts simply to keep moving. A detail meant less to shock than to underline just how far past ordinary human endurance this journey demanded. By the time the last hero finally located the hidden dwellings of the children of the forest, deep in territory no first man had willingly entered in years, he had lost every single one of his human companions. Only his direwolf remained beside him, itself half-starved and barely alive. What happened in that final meeting is described only in fragments, but the outcome is agreed upon across every version. The children, moved by what the last hero had survived to reach them, or perhaps simply recognizing that their own survival now depended on the same alliance his did, agreed to help. It is from this meeting, according to northern tradition, that the first men first learned the deadly effectiveness of dragonglass against the others. The same volcanic obsidian the children themselves had once used to create the very first White Walker, now turned into the substance that would help unmake them. Armed with that knowledge, and in some versions of the story, with actual weapons supplied directly by the children, the first men were finally able to fight the others on something closer to equal terms for the first time since the war began. The battle for the dawn. Armed at last with weapons that could actually kill their enemy, and united for the first time in the war's history with the children of the forest, fighting openly alongside them rather than against them, the first men mounted a final decisive campaign against the others and their army of the dead. This engagement is remembered across nearly every surviving tradition as the Battle for the Dawn, and it is described less as a single clash on a single field and more as a grinding, continent-spanning push that took years to complete, driving the others and their remaining whites steadily back toward the farthest, coldest reaches of the north from which they had first emerged. Details of the battle itself have not survived in any reliable form. What has survived is the outcome. The others were driven back, the endless winter finally broke, and for the first time in a generation, the sun was seen again across the whole of Westeros. It was not by any account a permanent victory. The others were pushed back, not destroyed outright, and the prophecy that grew out of this ending, whether framed as the promised return of Azor Ahai, or simply as a warning passed down through First Men tradition, always insisted that they would come again someday. It was this single, sobering fact, more than any other, that shaped nearly everything the survivors of the Long Night built in its immediate aftermath. Bran, the Builder's Wall. The most immediate and most lasting response to that fear came from a First Men leader remembered in the earliest histories as Bran the Builder. Working, according to legend, with direct assistance from the children of the forest, whose own magic was woven into the project in ways later generations would only be able to guess at, Bran oversaw the construction of an enormous wall of ice along the entire northern border of the continent, stretching for hundreds of miles from coast to coast, and standing, by the most consistent accounts, roughly 700 feet high at its tallest points. What made the wall more than simply an enormous ice barrier was the magic bound into its foundations. Ravens who study the oldest surviving records describe protective enchantments woven directly into the ice itself, spells intended specifically to prevent anything touched by the other's own magic from crossing it. This is why, across the 8,000 years that followed, the wall was consistently described not merely as a physical obstacle, difficult as that alone would have been to breach, but as something closer to a ward, an active barrier that kept the others and their whites from passing, so long as it stood intact and so long as it remained properly defended. Guarding a barrier of that scale required a permanent, dedicated garrison, and to provide one, Bran founded an order of sworn defenders who gave up land, titles, and family ties in exchange for a single lifelong purpose. This brotherhood, the Night's Watch, would go on to man the wall for the entirety of its recorded existence, and in its earliest centuries service in the Watch was considered one of the most honourable callings a man in Westeros could choose, an active, ongoing defence against a threat everyone alive still remembered firsthand. Alongside the wall and the order that guarded it, legend preserves the memory of a second, subtler defence. A great horn, said to have been crafted by a king beyond the wall named Joramun many centuries after the long night ended, capable, according to the old stories, of waking giants from the earth, and, in its most feared telling, of bringing the entire wall crashing down if ever it were sounded by the wrong hands. Whether the Horn of Winter, as it came to be called, was ever an actual object or simply another piece of the same mythology that had grown up around the Long Night, its legend persisted for thousands of years as a reminder that even the wall itself, for all its ancient magic, was never considered entirely unbreakable. 8,000 years of silence. For roughly 8,000 years after the Battle for the Dawn, the others did not return, or if they did stir during that period, no record of it survives that any modern reader would recognise as reliable. What did happen, steadily and almost imperceptibly across those centuries, was a slow, quiet erosion of everything the Long Night had once taught people to fear. In the earliest generations after the wall was completed, service in the Night's Watch remained genuinely prestigious, drawing younger sons of great houses and ambitious men eager to prove themselves defending the realm from a threat that still felt immediate and real. But threats that never materialize have a way of losing their urgency, generation by generation, and as century followed century without a single confirmed sighting of an other south of the wall, the Watch's purpose began to feel to more and more people living comfortable lives in the warmer south, like an old habit rather than a living necessity. By the time the story most people know begins, in the centuries just before Robert Baratheon's reign, the transformation was essentially complete. The Night's Watch had become, in the eyes of most of the great houses of Westeros, less a noble calling and more a convenient dumping ground, a place to send criminals as an alternative to execution, a place for bastards and disgraced younger sons to disappear without staining their family's name any further, a place, in short, that most people assumed existed to guard against wildling raiders from beyond the wall, rather than anything resembling the ancient enemy the Order had originally been founded to fight. The others themselves had drifted in the popular imagination into the same category as Grumpkins and Snarks, bedtime monsters invoked to frighten children, not genuine historical threats that any sensible adult needed to worry about. Maesters at the Citadel, the very scholars responsible for preserving the realm's history, largely treated the Long Night by this point as myth rather than established fact, a natural consequence of a period so distant, so poorly documented, and so thoroughly absorbed into folklore that separating what had actually happened from what storytellers had added over 8,000 years of retelling had become, for all practical purposes, impossible. It is against this backdrop of comfortable disbelief, an entire civilization that had spent thousands of years convincing itself its oldest and most dangerous enemy was nothing more than a story, that the others finally began stirring again. Old Nan's warnings, official skepticism at the Citadel and among the great houses never quite managed to erase the old fear entirely, and its most durable refuge across those 8,000 quiet years turned out to be exactly the place you would expect. The stories told to children at bedtime by the people old enough to have inherited them second-hand from parents and grandparents who had never fully let the warning go. In the north especially, where the wall itself stood as a constant physical reminder rather than a distant abstraction, servants and elderly keepers of castle lore kept the old tales alive in a form that lodged in the imagination of children, long before those same children grew old enough to be told, by tutors and maesters, that the stories weren't literally true. At Winterfell, this tradition survived most vividly in Old Nan, an elderly servant whose tales of the Long Night, the others, and the wall's true purpose left a lasting mark on the Stark children who grew up listening to her, particularly Bran, whose own eventual role as the keeper of the realm's deepest memory makes for a striking, almost circular echo of the woman who first told him these stories as bedtime entertainment rather than history. It is one of the quieter ironies of this entire saga that the true, verified history of the other's origin was ultimately confirmed not by any maester's careful research, but by a boy who had first heard the outline of that same story from an old woman spinning ghost stories by the fire, decades before anyone realized the ghosts were coming back. Even within the Night's Watch itself, belief never fully died out, no matter how far the Order's institutional culture drifted from its founding purpose. A handful of the Watch's older, more thoughtful members, most notably the ancient and blind Maester Aemon, who had spent decades at Castle Black after giving up his own claim to the Iron Throne generations earlier, continued to treat the old warnings as a live institutional responsibility rather than dead folklore, quietly ensuring that at least some record of the others and the proper methods for fighting them survived intact within the Order's own libraries, waiting for a generation that would actually need it. Aemon did not live to see the war fully won, but he lived long enough to see the first confirmed signs of its return, and by every account the news brought him less fear than a strange, sorrowful vindication for a warning he had spent his entire long life afraid no one would believe in time. The Citadel's last word, even the confirmation that finally reached the Night's Watch, did not travel very far before running into the same wall of institutional disbelief that had shaped the previous 8,000 years. When Samwell Tarly eventually made his way to Old Town to train as a Maester himself, carrying with him direct first-hand knowledge of dragonglass killing and other, and personal testimony of whites walking and fighting, the Citadel's own leadership treated the claims with the same polite, unmovable skepticism that had greeted every previous report of this kind for centuries. Requests to access restricted texts describing dragonglass, the others, and the old magic of the Long Night were quietly denied by an Archmaester more concerned with institutional order than with a returning threat he considered, at best, an exaggerated wildling superstition finding its way south through overly credulous rangers. It is a small, almost bureaucratic detail in the middle of a much larger and more dramatic war, but it says something important about how deeply the habit of disbelief had settled into the realm's most trusted institution. The Citadel existed, in theory, to preserve exactly this kind of knowledge for exactly this kind of emergency, and yet when the emergency actually arrived, the organization's default instinct was not curiosity, but caution, not investigation, but denial. Sam ultimately found what he needed by working around the Citadel's official channels rather than through them, quietly copying restricted texts himself rather than waiting for permission that was never going to come in time. It is, in its own understated way, one of the clearest illustrations in the entire story of how a warning can survive being ignored for thousands of years and still very nearly get ignored one final, fatal time, right up until the moment it no longer can be. The signs return. The first confirmed sighting of the others in living memory came not in some grand battle, but in the quiet, isolated wilderness beyond the wall where a small ranging party from the Night's Watch, led by a young, inexperienced officer named Waymar Royce, went looking for a group of wildlings who had failed to return from a hunting trip. What they found instead was worse than anything they expected. The wildlings were dead, arranged with a deliberate, unsettling precision that no natural cause could explain. Their remains laid out in a wide circular pattern that seemed designed less to kill than to send a message. Before the ranging party could report back, they were attacked directly by the others themselves, and only one man, a Night's Watch brother named Will, escaped to carry the news south. The response he received when he finally reached Winterfell captures, almost perfectly, exactly how far the realm's belief in the old threat had eroded. Rather than being treated as a witness to the return of humanity's oldest enemy, Will was tried and executed as a deserter. His account of what he had seen beyond the wall dismissed as either madness or an excuse invented to cover his own desertion. It would take considerably more evidence, delivered at considerably greater cost, before anyone with real power in Westeros began taking the warning seriously. That evidence began accumulating from an unexpected direction. The wildling clans living beyond the wall itself, who had never had the luxury of dismissing the others as folklore, because they were the ones actually living closest to wherever the threat was stirring again. Reports began filtering south of entire wildling settlements, found abandoned or slaughtered, of strange, unseasonal cold gripping the far north, even in what should have been the height of summer, and of increasingly desperate migrations as more and more free folk clans began moving south toward the wall itself, not to raid it as their ancestors sometimes had, but to beg in effect, to be let through it. There is a broader, stranger backdrop to all of this worth noting, one that most people in Westeros lived with their entire lives without ever fully connecting to the others at all: the seasons themselves. Unlike almost anywhere else in the known world, summers and winters in Westeros do not follow a predictable yearly cycle. A summer might last a single season, or stretch on comfortably for close to a decade, and winters, when they finally arrive, are notoriously unpredictable in both their timing and their severity, sometimes brief and mild, sometimes lasting years and killing thousands through cold and famine alike. No natural explanation for this irregularity has ever been confirmed, and the oldest theories, quietly preserved among northern maesters and largely dismissed elsewhere as superstition, tie the phenomenon directly back to the same magic that produced the long night in the first place, as though the natural rhythm of the world itself was permanently disrupted by that original catastrophe and never fully recovered. House Stark's ancient words warning that winter is coming read, against this backdrop, less like a general statement about the weather and more like a very specific, very old piece of institutional memory. A reminder passed down through 8,000 years, precisely because the family saying it had never fully stopped believing that a bad enough winter might someday bring more than just snow. Jon Snow and the Watch's awakening. It was into this slowly building crisis that Jon Snow, the supposed bastard son of Eddard Stark, took the Black and joined the Night's Watch, arriving at Castle Black with little idea of just how directly his own life was about to become entangled with the very threat most of his new brothers had spent their careers assuming was extinct. The Watch's own awakening to the returning danger came in stages, each more alarming than the last. Early in Jon's time at Castle Black, the Lord Commander, Jorah Mormont, received the reanimated corpse of a ranger believed long dead, which rose and attacked him directly inside his own private chambers, forcing Jon to fight off and ultimately destroy a wight with his bare hands and a lucky grab for fire, one of the first confirmed encounters with the other's resurrected soldiers in generations. The attack was impossible to dismiss as rumour or wildling exaggeration. It had happened inside the Watcher's own walls, and it convinced Mormont to commit to something the Order hadn't attempted in living memory. A large-scale ranging expedition north of the Wall to investigate the scale of the threat directly. That expedition led the Watch to Craster's Keep, the isolated homestead of a wildling named Craster, who had maintained an uneasy, decades-long truce with the Order by offering them shelter, at a steep and deeply disturbing price, the Watch only fully understood once they arrived. Craster fathered children exclusively with his own daughters, and any son born of those unions was taken from the keep as an infant and left in the woods as an offering, a tribute paid directly to the others in exchange for being left alone. It was one of the expedition's most unsettling discoveries, and it confirmed something the Watch had not previously understood about the others' relationship to the living, that they could be bargained with in a fashion by those desperate or ruthless enough to try. The expedition itself ended in disaster. Encamped at an ancient fortification called the Fist of the First Men, a defensible ring of earthworks that First Men soldiers had once used for exactly this purpose thousands of years earlier, the Watcher's forces were overwhelmed in a coordinated night attack by the others, and a white horde far larger than anyone had anticipated. The attack came with almost no warning, whites rising out of the surrounding snow in numbers. The defenders' torches and dragonglass weapons could not hold back fast enough, and what should have been the Watch's strongest, most experienced company scattered into a chaotic retreat that cost the Order the bulk of the men who had marched out with such confidence only weeks earlier. In the chaos of that retreat, a mutiny broke out among the survivors sheltering afterward at Craster's Keep, driven by resentment, exhaustion, and outright terror rather than any single grievance. A faction of the surviving Rangers, no longer willing to follow orders that had already led them into one massacre, turned on their own officers, and Lord Commander Mormont himself was killed by men who had sworn the same oath he had, ending his life not at the hands of the enemy he had spent the expedition trying to understand, but at the hands of his own brothers. It was during the confusion of that same mutiny that Samwell Tarly made his escape with Craster's surviving wife, Gilly, and her infant son, and in the process became the first confirmed living person in generations to kill a White Walker directly, driving a dragonglass dagger into one that cornered the small group as they fled. The other did not simply fall when struck. It shattered entirely, dissolving into fragments of ice and frost, definitive, undeniable proof that the old legends about dragonglass had been telling the truth all along. That mutiny's aftermath would echo years later in a second, even more consequential betrayal within the Watcher's own ranks. Once Jon Snow, having survived the Fist and returned from his own time living among the wildlings, was elected Lord Commander, his insistence on allowing the free folk through the wall struck a faction within Castle Black, led by the veteran officer Alliser Thorne and quietly encouraged by a resentful steward named Bowen Marsh, as an unforgivable betrayal of everything the Watch had always stood for. Their response mirrored the mutiny at Craster's Keep almost exactly. Rather than challenge Jon's leadership openly, they lured him into the open under false pretenses and killed him, convinced that removing him would undo a decision they considered a betrayal of the Order's oldest enemy. It would take a resurrection, rather than a change of heart, to settle that particular argument once and for all. Craster's bargain completed. The full horror of what Craster had actually been offering the others in exchange for his family's safety only became clear much later, and it came, fittingly, through the same visionary power that had already revealed the ancient origin of the White Walkers to Bran Stark. In one of his visions into the deeper past, Bran witnessed directly what became of the infant sons Craster had spent years leaving out in the woods. The Night King himself would arrive, lift the abandoned child, and with nothing more dramatic than a single touch of one finger to the infant's cheek, complete a transformation that echoed, almost exactly, the ritual the children of the forest had once performed on a captured first man 12,000 years earlier. The baby's eyes turned the same, unmistakable crystalline blue in an instant, and what had been a helpless infant became, in that same moment, the newest member of an army that had been slowly, patiently rebuilding its own numbers for thousands of years, one abandoned child at a time. This single revelation reframed a great deal of what had otherwise looked, from the Watch's limited vantage point, like an isolated, disturbing local custom, into something far larger and more unsettling. Proof that the others did not need the exact original ritual circumstances of the Long Night to keep expanding their own ranks, and that Craster's long uneasy truce with the White Walkers had not simply spared his family from attack, but had actively, if unknowingly on his part, been feeding their numbers for as long as his bargain had lasted. It also confirmed something the oldest legends had always hinted at, but never stated outright, that becoming a White Walker was not necessarily limited to the specific, dramatic dragonglass ritual of the ancient war, but could apparently be accomplished by the Night King alone, using nothing more than his own touch on anyone he chose. Wildlings on the run. While the Night's Watch was piecing together the scale of what it was facing, an entirely separate and equally consequential response to the same threat was unfolding beyond the wall, led by a former member of the Watch himself who had abandoned his vows years earlier to live among the free folk. Mance Rayder, once a Night's Watch ranger, and by the time this story catches up with him, the self-declared king beyond the wall, had spent years accomplishing something no wildling leader before him had ever managed. Uniting dozens of fiercely independent free folk clans, tribes that had spent centuries raiding and feuding with each other as readily as they raided the Watch, into a single coordinated force. Mance's goal, crucially, was never conquest. It was survival. Having seen firsthand what was gathering in the far north, Mance understood, better than almost anyone south of the wall at the time, that the only realistic future for the free folk lay on the other side of that barrier, and that the only way to get an army's worth of men, women and children safely through or over it was by force, since the Watch had no intention of simply opening the gates for a people it had spent generations treating as raiders and enemies. The resulting confrontation, a massive assault on Castle Black itself involving thousands of wildling fighters, giants, and even a captured mammoth, came remarkably close to overwhelming the Watch's badly undermanned garrison, and was only broken by the unexpected arrival of Stannis Baratheon's army, which struck the wildling forces from behind at the decisive moment, and shattered what remained of Mance's coalition. Mance himself was captured in the battle's aftermath, and the argument over what to do with him revealed, in miniature, exactly how differently people who understood the scale of the northern threat were prepared to act compared to those who still saw the wildlings as nothing more than an old enemy to be punished. Stannis and his followers wanted Mance burned alive as an example. Jon Snow, who by this point had spent enough time among the free folk to understand that Mance's people were fleeing the same enemy the Watch itself existed to fight, argued unsuccessfully for clemency, and when the execution proceeded regardless, it was Jon who ultimately granted Mance a faster, more merciful death with an arrow rather than let him burn. It was this same underlying conviction that the wildlings were refugees from a shared enemy rather than a separate threat to be punished that would guide Jon's most consequential and most controversial decision once he was elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch shortly afterward, opening the gates and allowing the surviving free folk to pass south of the wall, rather than leaving them to die on the wrong side of it. Hardhome nothing did more to justify that controversial decision than what Jon witnessed with his own eyes at Hardhome, a large wildling settlement on the northern coast where thousands of free folk who had refused to follow Mance still remained, unprotected and largely unaware of just how close the danger had come to their own doorstep. Jon travelled there personally, hoping to convince the settlement's remaining leaders to accept the same offer he had extended to Mance's people, passage south of the wall in exchange for allegiance to the Night's Watch. The negotiation was still underway when the attack began. Older than the Watch. It is worth pausing on why the free folk, more than almost anyone else in this story, never needed convincing that the others were real. While the great houses south of the wall had spent thousands of years comfortably reclassifying the Long Night as folklore, the clans living beyond the wall had never had that luxury, since any threat stirring in the far north reached their settlements first, long before it ever became a rumour worth repeating at a southern lord's dinner table. Wildling oral tradition, distinct from the Night's Watch's own increasingly sceptical institutional memory, preserved a far more practical, unromantic understanding of the others. Not distant legend, but a recurring generational danger that shaped where the free folk chose to settle, how far north any clan dared to range, and which stretches of territory were quietly avoided regardless of how good the hunting looked. Tormund Giantsbane, one of the more prominent free folk leaders to eventually ally with Jon Snow, embodied this older, harder-won relationship with the threat about as well as anyone in the story. Where southern lords required direct, undeniable proof before they would even entertain the possibility that the others had returned, wirelings like Tormund required no convincing at all, because their entire culture had never fully stopped preparing for exactly this possibility. It is one of the story's more pointed ironies that the people the Night's Watch had spent generations treating as its primary enemy, raiding across the same border the Watch existed to defend, turned out to be the group most naturally suited to becoming its allies once the actual ancient enemy reappeared, sharing not just a common threat but a far deeper, more continuous cultural memory of what that threat actually was and how it behaved. The others arrived at Hardhome in overwhelming numbers, backed by a white horde that seemed to appear from every direction at once, and the resulting massacre unfolded faster and more completely than anything the defenders, or Jon himself, could meaningfully resist. Thousands of free folk who had survived the earlier war against Mance's rivals, against the Watch, and against each other, were killed, and in the single most chilling image to come out of the entire conflict, immediately reanimated as whites by the presence of a White Walker commander overseeing the slaughter. It was during the retreat from Hardhome that Jon came face to face for the first time in his life with the Night King himself standing alone and unhurried at the edge of the chaos he had just orchestrated. In a gesture that needed no translation, the Night King raised his arms and in a single fluid motion resurrected every one of the newly dead scattered across the battlefield, transforming Jon's own allies into fresh soldiers for the very army that had just killed them, right in front of the survivors still struggling to escape by boat. It was, more than any report or rumour that had reached Castle Black up to that point, definitive proof of exactly what the Watch, and by extension all of Westeros, was actually facing. An enemy that did not just kill the people in its path, but converted every single death into another soldier for its own side, growing larger and more unstoppable with every settlement it destroyed. The weapons that could kill them, as the scale of the threat became impossible to ignore. The practical question facing the Watch and its few allies shifted from whether the others were real to how, exactly, anyone was supposed to fight an army that ordinary steel could not touch. The answer, as the oldest legends had always insisted, came down to two materials, and Westeros in this era possessed only limited supplies of either. Dragonglass, the volcanic obsidian that had first created the others and would now be used to destroy them, existed in meaningful quantity in only a handful of locations across the Seven Kingdoms, and the largest known deposit sat, in one of the story's more useful coincidences, directly beneath Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen. When Stannis Baratheon controlled the island, he granted the Night's Watch access to mine it, providing Samwell Tarly and the rest of the Hotch with the raw material to arm ordinary rangers with weapons capable of actually killing what they were fighting for the first time in centuries. Later, once Daenerys Targaryen took possession of Dragonstone herself, continuing and expanding that mining operation became one of the earliest and most consequential points of practical cooperation between her forces and Jon Snow's, laying the groundwork for the larger alliance that would eventually follow. Valyrian steel presented a far harder problem, since no new blades of that quality had been forged in the roughly 150 years since the secret of its making died alongside Valyria itself. Every Valyrian steel sword remaining in Westeros by this point in the story was an heirloom, passed down through a handful of great houses for generations, and there were vanishingly few of them. Ice, the ancestral greatsword of House Stark, was famously melted down and reforged by the Lannisters into two smaller blades, Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail, after Eddard Stark's execution. Long Claw, the bastard sword once carried by Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, passed to Jon Snow and became one of the very few Valyrian steel weapons in active use against the others during the war's final years. And a single Valyrian steel dagger, originally used in a failed assassination attempt against Bran Stark years earlier, and later gifted by Bran himself to Arya, would go on to end the entire 12,000-year conflict in a single strike, a detail that makes the weapon's earlier, seemingly unrelated appearance in the story read, in hindsight, like the setup to the most consequential payoff in the entire history of Westeros: the search for the prince who was promised. Woven through nearly every stage of this modern reawakening was a search that had by this point already been running for thousands of years. The followers of the Lord of Light, scattered across the known world in service of a religion built directly on the promised return of Azor Ahai, actively looking for signs that the ancient hero had finally been reborn. Melisandre, the Red Priestess most directly entangled in this part of the story, spent years utterly convinced that Stannis Baratheon was that promised figure, the prince who was promised, reborn amid smoke and salt exactly as the old prophecy described, and she reshaped an entire military campaign around that conviction, providing Stannis with the legitimacy and a fervent, fire-fueled support base he could not have assembled through his own claim to the throne alone. That conviction did not survive Stannis's catastrophic defeat in the north, a collapse made worse by the fact that he had sacrificed his own daughter to the very god Melisandre served in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to secure the victory the prophecy had promised him. Shaken and, by her own admission, uncertain for the first time in years about what she actually understood of her own god's plans, Melisandre redirected her search toward Jon Snow instead, a shift that culminated in the single most consequential act of her long life, using what remained of her power to bring him back from death, whether or not he was in fact the figure the prophecy had described. Whether Jon, Stannis, Daenerys, or anyone else in this story actually was the prince or princess who was promised remains, deliberately, an open question. the prophecy's own ambiguous wording, preserved across cultures that could not agree on whether the promised hero would be a prince or a princess, left room for multiple claimants and multiple interpretations right up until the war's actual conclusion, and the fact that the war was ultimately won not by a figure fulfilling any of the old religion's specific criteria, but by a girl trained as an assassin who had no interest in prophecy at all, suggest that the old texts, however sincerely believed, may simply have been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. A death and a return. Jon's growing conviction that the wildlings needed to be treated as allies rather than enemies did not sit well with everyone under his command, and the resentment it stirred among a faction of his own Night's Watch brothers eventually turned lethal. In a coordinated mutiny at Castle Black, a group led by senior officers who had never accepted his leadership or his sympathy for the free folk lured Jon into the open and stabbed him repeatedly, leaving him to die in the snow outside his own quarters, killed by the very order he had spent years trying to save. It might have ended there had it not been for Melisandre, the Red Priestess who had spent years insisting that Stannis Baratheon was the promised hero of ancient prophecy, only to watch that conviction collapse alongside Stannis' own disastrous campaign in the north. Returning to Castle Black in the aftermath of his death and her own faith badly shaken, Melisandre used what remained of her power in a desperate, uncertain ritual to bring Jon back from death entirely, an act of resurrection so far outside ordinary human experience that even she did not appear fully confident it would work until it did. Jon returned changed by the experience in ways he rarely spoke about afterward, but the practical consequence was immediate and significant. The watch that had murdered its own Lord Commander now had to answer to a man who had, in the most literal sense possible, already died once for the cause his mutineers had opposed. Jon oversaw the execution of the ringleaders responsible for his death, and having concluded that his usefulness to the Watch's original mission had run its course, left to reclaim Winterfell from the Bolton family occupying it, a campaign that would eventually put him back in direct control of the very kingdom closest to the threat he now understood better than anyone else alive. The truth beneath the weirwood. While Jon fought to retake the north on the ground, his younger brother Bran was uncovering the deepest layer of this entire history from an entirely different direction, one that finally closed the loop connecting the ancient origin of the others to the war unfolding in the present day. After fleeing Winterfell during its earlier fall to Theon Greyjoy, Bran had journeyed far beyond the wall in search of the mysterious figure known as the Three-Eyed Raven, a man who had, over centuries of isolation, fused into the roots of an ancient weirwood, accumulated more knowledge of the realm's true history than the entire Citadel combined. Under his guidance, Bran learned to access visions stretching back across the full breadth of Westerosi history, and it was through one of these visions, reaching all the way back to the earliest days of the war between the Children of the Forest and the First Men, that Bran personally witnessed the ritual that had created the very first White Walker, the Circle of Green Seers, the captive man, the shard of dragon glass driven into his heart, and the terrible transformation that followed. It was, in effect, confirmation from inside the realm's own deepest magic of a story that had otherwise survived only as fragmented legend, and it established beyond any remaining doubt exactly what the Children of the Forest had done, why they had done it, and what it had eventually cost everyone, themselves included. That same power came at a steep cost. While exploring visions of the gathering threat beyond the wall, Bran was noticed in turn by the Night King, who reached directly across whatever boundary separated the vision from the waking world and marked him, a connection that allowed the Night King to track Bran down at the remote cave where he had been training. In the attack that followed, the elderly three-eyed raven who had trained Bran was killed, but not before transferring the full weight of his accumulated knowledge into Bran in his final moments, making Bran himself the new three-eyed raven and, in the process, giving the Night King a direct and permanent reason to want him dead. As the living memory of the entire realm, Bran represented a threat to the others that no ordinary army possibly could. Capturing a white. By this point in the story, the political situation in Westeros had grown complicated in a way that made the northern threat even harder to address effectively. Daenerys Targaryen had arrived in Westeros with her armies and her dragons, determined to reclaim the Iron Throne from Cersei Lannister, and Cersei herself, unwilling to believe reports of an undead army marching south, refused to commit any of her own forces to a fight she considered either exaggerated or a convenient excuse for her enemies to weaken each other before turning on her. To force the issue, Jon and a small company that included Ser Jorah Mormont, the wildling leader Tormund Giantsbane, the resurrected outlaw Beric Dondarrion, and the Hound Sandor Clegane, ventured beyond the wall on an extraordinarily dangerous mission, capturing a single white and bringing it back alive, or at least animate, as physical proof that would be difficult for even the most stubborn skeptic to dismiss. The mission succeeded in its immediate goal, securing a white after a tense and costly skirmish, but the company found itself stranded on an isolated rock, surrounded by the advancing dead, before Daenerys arrived with her dragons to rescue them personally. That rescue came at a devastating price. As Daenerys' dragons covered the company's escape, the Night King, revealing a capability no one in the group had anticipated, hurled an ice spear with enough force and precision to bring down one of her three dragons, Viserion, killing him in a single throw and sending his body crashing into the frozen lake below. It was a demonstration, delivered with the same silent efficiency the Night King had shown at Hardhome, that the war ahead would not simply be a matter of overwhelming the dead with dragonfire. Worse followed almost immediately. The Night King approached Viserion's submerged body, and, exactly as he had raised the newly dead at Hardhome, reanimated the dragon itself, pulling him from the icy water reborn as an undead, ice-breathing weapon under his direct command, a living, or rather unliving, symbol of just how completely the others could turn the living world's own power against it. The wall falls. Armed with a dragon of his own, for the first time in this entire ancient conflict, the Night King marched his combined army to Eastwatch by the Sea, the easternmost stronghold anchoring the wall's ancient magic, and did something no force in 8,000 years of recorded history had ever managed to accomplish. Riding directly to the base of the wall itself, he had the reanimated Viserion unleash a blast of pale blue dragon fire directly into the ancient ice. A fire that, unlike anything natural, did not simply melt the barrier but shattered it outright, bringing down a massive section of the wall in a single catastrophic breach. The significance of that moment is difficult to overstate. For 8,000 years, the wall's ancient magic had been treated as an absolute, unbreakable line. The one guarantee that whatever the realm's other troubles, the others themselves could never cross back into Westeros so long as the barrier and its wards remained intact. That guarantee ended in a single afternoon, and with it, the entire premise that had shaped Westerosi complacency about the northern threat for thousands of years. The army of the dead, no longer needing to scale or besiege the barrier at all, simply marched through the breach and began advancing south directly toward Winterfell, the seat of the one great house that had never fully abandoned its old fear of exactly this moment. The Great War for the Dawn, what followed at Winterfell was, by every account that survives it, the single largest and most desperate battle fought in Westeros since the Long Night itself, and it very nearly ended the same way that First War almost had, in total defeat for the living. Every surviving force that could be gathered, northern soldiers, the free folk who had once fought against the Watch and now fought beside it, Daenerys's unsullied and Dothraki riders, and the Knights of the Vale, assembled behind Winterfell's walls to make a stand against an army that vastly outnumbered them and that grew larger, in a horribly literal sense, with every defender it managed to kill. The battle's opening phase went about as badly as the most pessimistic among the defenders had feared. The Dothraki cavalry, sent out to meet the first wave of the dead head-on, were annihilated almost instantly, their flaming swords visibly winking out one after another in the distance, a silent signal to everyone watching from the walls of just how badly outmatched the living truly were. Melisandre, using the last reserves of her own fire magic, ignited a defensive trench around the castle that briefly held the tide back, buying the defenders precious hours they would not otherwise have had. Even so, the castle's outer defences collapsed steadily as the night wore on, and individual acts of desperate sacrifice, rather than any coordinated strategy, kept the battle from ending in outright annihilation before dawn. Not every part of the defence unfolded on the open field. Believing Winterfell's ancient crypts, packed with the remains of generations of Starks, would offer the safest shelter for the non-combatants, castle leaders sent women, children, and the elderly underground to wait out the battle away from the fighting above. It proved a bitter miscalculation. The dead sheltering there, once bitten or killed by an infiltrating wight that made its way into the crypts unnoticed, rose again in the dark and confined spaces meant to be the one place in the entire castle guaranteed to be safe, turning a refuge into a trap and forcing terrified survivors to fight for their lives, armed with little more than improvised weapons and whatever nerve they had left. Above ground, Brienne of Tarth and Jaime Lannister fought side by side at the centre of the worst of the fighting, an image that would have seemed almost unthinkable earlier in the story, given how differently their paths had once crossed, while Samwell Tarly, never a natural warrior even by his own admission, was buried and nearly killed beneath a pile of wights before being pulled free at the last possible moment. Grey Worm organised the Unsullied into disciplined spear formations that held their line with a coldness that almost matched their enemies, buying critical time even as the ground around them was steadily lost. High above the battlefield, Bran, unable to fight in any conventional sense, used his own warging ability to see through the eyes of a raven circling the chaos below, feeding what limited intelligence he could gather back to the commanders trying, with rapidly diminishing options, to hold the castle together. By the final hour before dawn, with the castle's defences effectively broken, and the surviving defenders scattered in isolated pockets of resistance, the battle looked, by any reasonable measure, already lost. Theon Greyjoy, seeking to atone for a betrayal of the Stark family years earlier, died defending Bran directly in the Oddswood, buying the crucial seconds Bran needed as the Night King himself finally arrived to finish what he had started years earlier when he first marked him. Ser Jorah Mormont died shielding Daenerys from the advancing dead, when her remaining dragons alone could no longer hold them back. It was decided, in the end, not by the armies, not by the dragons, and not by any of the great lords and commanders who had spent the entire battle trying to hold the line, but by a single, quiet act of stealth that almost no one on the battlefield even witnessed happen. Arya Stark, who had spent years training among the faceless men of Braavos to become one of the deadliest fighters in the known world, slipped through the chaos surrounding Bran and the Night King, and, in a single motion, drove a blade of Valyrian steel directly into his chest. The effect was immediate and absolute. The Night King, the original White Walker, the man once transformed by a shard of drag glass into something that had outlived every civilization built after him, shattered into fragments of ice exactly as every White Walker before him had. And in that same instant, his entire army, every white he had ever raised, every soldier stolen from every settlement he had destroyed across thousands of miles and thousands of years, collapsed into lifeless ice and dust simultaneously, as though the magic animating all of them had only ever run through him in the first place. A war that had begun 12,000 years earlier with a desperate ritual performed by frightened greenseers trying to save their own people from extinction, ended in a single strike, on a single night, delivered by someone none of the ancient prophecies had ever specifically named, after the ice. The morning that followed the Battle of Winterfell brought a kind of silence the survivors had not heard in months. No distant horns, no advancing cold, no army massing beyond the tree line. Melisandre, having spent decades of her long, unnaturally extended life searching for the promised hero, and the war that hero was meant to win, chose that same morning to remove the enchanted ruby that had kept her artificially young for longer than anyone around her fully understood, and walked out alone into the snow to die of old age within sight of the battlefield, where the war she had spent her life preparing for had finally definitively ended. It was as close to a fitting death as the story ever offered her. A woman who had given up nearly everything chasing a prophecy, present at last for its actual, unglamorous conclusion. What remained afterward was less a clean victory than an accounting of loss. Winterfell's Godswood, courtyards and crypts were filled with the dead of an army that had, in the space of a single night, lost a meaningful fraction of every force that had gathered to defend it. The wall itself remained broken at Eastwatch, its ancient wards permanently compromised, though with the Night King destroyed and his army scattered into inert ice, the breach no longer carried the same existential danger it had represented while he still lived. The Night's Watch, an order that had existed for 8,000 years for the specific purpose of guarding against exactly the threat that had just been defeated, found itself in the strange position of having finally, completely fulfilled its founding purpose, with no clear sense of what its purpose was supposed to be afterward. For Jon Snow personally, the war against the dead turned out to be only half of what the rest of that year would demand of him. The larger political struggle for the Aeon throne temporarily set aside while the army of the dead marched south, resumed almost immediately once the immediate threat was gone, and the same qualities that had made Jon an effective leader against an enemy that could not be reasoned with, decisiveness, a willingness to make unpopular calls, an unwillingness to compromise on what he believed was right, would be tested again in an entirely different and in some ways more painful kind of conflict. But that is a different story, belonging to the war for the throne rather than the war against the dead, and it does not diminish what had just been accomplished at Winterfell. An ancient enemy, first created by a desperate, frightened people 12,000 years earlier, and mythologized ever since as an unstoppable, world-ending force, had finally, permanently been undone. What the Long Night actually teaches, strip away the ice magic and the dragons, and the story of the White Walkers is, at its core, a story about the specific recurring danger of forgetting. Every stage of this history depended in one form or another on someone choosing not to believe a warning that had already been given. The children of the forest created their own destroyer because they were desperate enough to reach for a weapon they didn't fully understand. The first men who first faced the others paid in blood for not recognizing quickly enough exactly what they were dealing with. And the 8,000 years of relative peace that followed the battle for the dawn produced, generation by generation, an entire civilization that talked itself out of believing its own founding legend, right up until the evidence became impossible to explain away. It is worth noticing, too, how much of what finally defeated the others depended on people the realm's official structures had spent generations dismissing or distrusting. It was a hedge knight's bastard-born grandson, a supposed bastard himself, who first took the returning threat seriously enough to act on it. It was wildlings, treated as raiders and enemies for centuries, who ended up providing some of the war's most essential allies and its clearest institutional memory of what the others actually were. It was a boy left disabled by a fall, dismissed by nearly everyone as a burden rather than an asset, who carried the single piece of knowledge that finally explained where the entire threat had come from. And it was a girl no prophecy had ever named, trained in skills no one expected a highborn Stark daughter to need, who delivered this single strike that ended a war 12,000 years in the making. None of the ancient prophecies got the ending quite right. Azor Ahai was supposed to return wielding a burning sword forged from a wife's sacrifice. The last hero was supposed to be remembered by name. Instead, the war ended with a dagger, a girl, and a single moment of silence on a battlefield. Most of the defenders were too busy fighting for their own lives to even witness. Perhaps that is the most honest thing this story ever says about prophecy in general, that it tells you correctly that something terrible is coming and that it can, in fact, be stopped. But it almost never tells you, accurately, who's actually going to be the one to stop it. A warning kept, a warning fulfilled. There is a strange, almost circular symmetry to how this entire story treats belief. It opens with a warning that everybody in Westeros had heard and almost nobody still credited, that something walked in the far north, that it had nearly ended the world once already, and that a wall of ice and 8,000 years of watchmen stood between that ending and everyone still living comfortably south of it. It closes with the same warning, fully vindicated, at a cost measured in the lives of an entire generation of Northmen, wildlings, and everyone who came to fight alongside them, and with the single detail that made the warning survive at all, turning out to be the thing every sceptical maester and every dismissive southern lord had always considered the least reliable part of the whole story. An old woman's bedtime tale kept alive by servants and children rather than scholars and kings, waiting patiently in the dark for a moment when it would finally matter again. It is worth asking, honestly, what actually saved Westeros in the end. Not the Iron Throne, which spent the entire war treating the threat as a rumour convenient for weakening its enemies. Not the Citadel, which had spent centuries quietly filing the long night under myth rather than history. It was the Wall, built by a first man who took the previous war seriously enough to spend a lifetime guarding against its return. It was the Night's Watch, an order that decayed into a punishment for criminals but never entirely forgot, in its oldest oaths and its oldest libraries, what it had actually been founded to do. It was wildlings who had never had the luxury of disbelief, and a handful of people, a bastard, a broken boy, a girl trained to kill, who happened to be standing in the right place once the warning everyone else had spent thousands of years learning to ignore finally, unmistakably, came true. 12,000 years after a group of frightened, desperate people first turned a captured man into a monster to save themselves from extinction, it was that same monster's own creation, undone at last, that finally let Westeros stop looking over its shoulder at the north and start worrying once again about the much more familiar, much more human dangers waiting closer to home.